Today we're going to meet the patron saint of Catania, all of Sicily, and one of the patron saints of Malta. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love history and travel. If you find my content interesting, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. The lady's name was Agatha, a maker of history. Like so many people who lived in the past, her story is a blend of fact, guesswork, and mythology. However, we do know that Agatha was one of the most highly venerated Christian martyrs of antiquity. She was put to death for her determined profession of faith, which included repeatedly spurning the attentions and demands of a Roman officer. Agatha is shown here as a beautiful young woman, unmarked and untouched by all her troubles. The red in her robe is the color of fire, blood, and martyrdom. The off-white is a symbol of purity. The palm branch is a symbol of martyrdom. Rather obvious at the bottom of this painting are her two breasts, often shown in the form of pastry on a plate. Depictions of Agatha usually include the pincers that were used to torture her, although they are missing from this image. Let me tell you her story today on Makers of History from the Armchair Traveler. Agatha is a Catholic saint, a martyred virgin from the early 3rd century with a long history of veneration both in Catania, where she was probably born about 231 AD, in the rest of Sicily, where she's a patron saint, and even in Malta, where she might have taken refuge. History tells us she was martyred and died in Sicily on February 5, 251 AD. This painting shows a young Roman girl, but clearly after her death and ascent into heaven, probably around age 20 or so. Notice that the pastries and palm branch we saw earlier are seen here. The story goes that Agatha was born in Catania, or maybe Palermo, they both claim her. Either way, she was part of a wealthy Roman family with considerable social and economic status. Early on, she decided she was going to dedicate her virginity to God. The story gets more murky from here on. We do know that during the reign of Roman Emperor Decian, Christians were openly persecuted, not just for their religion, but in some cases as an excuse to seize their property. One such Roman official, some say he was a military officer, others say he was an influential prefect in the area, named Quintanius, learned about Agatha. The legend says that he, upon seeing her, fell madly in love. It's far more likely, though, that his true desire was to gain control of her rather rich family's property and lands. The satisfaction of his lustful desire might have been important, but was secondary. Either way, he made advances. Agatha rejected the amorous advances of Quintanius. Whether he was looking for marriage or a hookup is really not documented. Quintanius was annoyed at not getting his way. I think he probably had some lust, but mostly his lust was for the family's property. He wasn't about to let some uppity teenage girl get between him and money. He had her arrested and hauled before a judge. To her dismay, he was the judge, as is shown in this stained glass window from the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Saint-Lô in France. He had her locked up in a brothel with orders to service the paying customers, thinking he could not only devalue her but force her to change her mind. She continued to say no. He then had her dragged back to court for one last appearance. She said no again. At that point, thoroughly annoyed, Quintanius ordered her to be tortured and eventually executed by being tied to a rack of hot coals. There was nothing subtle about Quintanius's method. Throughout much of the history of the Roman Empire, it was illegal to execute a virgin, which he assumed the brothel experience might have eliminated. Apparently, it did not. Whether out of anger at her ability to get around it, or the rebuff of his advances, or the failure of her to just plain die, he sent her off to jail with orders that she be tortured and her breasts cut off. In this relatively tame image, now in the Uffizi Museum, we see her being held in torture. The story goes that the jailers amputated one or possibly both of her breasts with hot pincers, as shown here in this painting. She was stretched on a rack to be torn with iron hooks, burned with torches, and whipped. Still, she didn't die. Agatha, maimed and suffering, didn't die from that abuse. In jail, she received a visit from St. Peter, who appeared to her and treated her wounds. Quintanius was furious that she was still alive, so he ordered that she be forced onto a bed of hot coals and burned. The story winds up with an earthquake rocking the city during the last torture. Quintanius is painted as a coward who had sent her back to prison to rot while he fled the city. She died a few hours later on February 5th in the year 251. There's a kernel of historical truth in this narrative. There's some archaeological evidence that suggests that a strong earthquake occurred at probably around that time. Art sometimes is like a camera lens that depicts reality, but far more often gives us an interpretation of that reality. Some of the paintings about Agatha's tortures and death are quite gruesome, featuring a great deal of gore. Others, like this one, still explain exactly what happened if you knew the story, but the visualization isn't just idealized, but somewhat romanticized. The conceit here being that this is an image of her after death and freedom from all her troubles. This depiction shows her as a wealthy and quite beautiful Florentine woman from the mid-1600s. Sicilians remember Agatha for a very practical reason. The people of Catania are extremely devoted to her. Remember that the Romans planned to burn her at the stake or possibly on a bed of hot coals and then backed off, at least temporarily? The story continues that an earthquake saved her from that fate. When there is a danger of eruption from nearby Mount Etna volcano, locals carry a statue of the saint to the mountain, hoping she'll stop the flow of lava. This photo shows you the Sapienza Refuge. It's basically a bar and hotel complex on the shoulder of Mount Etna. You can see the volcano in the background. This is the interior of the bar at Sapienza Refuge, a combination hotel, spa, bar, restaurant, and an enormous parking lot on the shoulder of Mount Etna. I didn't find out whether Agatha, shown in a small hanging glass to the side of the window in this image, was there before or after the lava, but that black stuff you see behind the broken glass is hardened lava. Mount Etna was the source of earthquakes and has been in a state of near constant rumblings and eruptions for millennia. In one of them, lava flowed downhill in the general direction of the refuge. You can see where it got stopped here, just outside the windows of what is now the bar. Agatha is also one of the patron saints of Malta, but they have a different version of her life story. To understand the Maltese version, you need to know that Paul of Tarsus, later St. Paul, was shipwrecked in Sicily along with Luke, yes, the apostle, he was also a physician, in the general vicinity of what's now called St. Paul's Bay around 60 AD. Paul was a prisoner, but he was also a Roman citizen, and he was on the way to Rome to claim his rights to a fair trial. When he was shipwrecked, Paul was met and sheltered by a man named Publius, who later became known as Saint Publius. This was nearly 2 centuries before the Maltese think that Agatha arrived on the island. According to their tradition, Agatha fled Sicily before she was arrested, possibly with a few of her friends, and took refuge here in Malta. She stayed there for a short time, preaching and spreading Christianity. This large statuary group sits inside the Medina Gate. Medina was the old capital of Malta. It shows on the left, unfortunately in this image hidden by a tree, St. Publius, the prelate who introduced Christianity to the island, St. Paul in the center, who was shipwrecked here, and who is also said to have met Publius, and Agatha on the right. Agatha's visit to Malta is remembered centuries later, not for intercession in a volcano or an earthquake, but because she came to the aid of the Maltese against a Turkish invasion. Turkish invasions and carrying off of prisoners as slaves was an annual event in the mid-1500s before the Great Siege. On one raid in 1551, Dragut and the Ottomans came and decided they would just take over Malta. After only a few days, however, for some reason that's never been explained, Dragut broke off the siege and moved to the neighboring island of Gozo. The people on the big island of Malta attribute this to Agatha's intercessions. Apparently her powers of protection did not extend to protecting the people of Gozo. Catania's main cathedral is dedicated to St. Agatha. The top image here is a wide view of the St. Agatha altar, with sections devoted to the Virgin Mary on the left, St. Joseph on the right, and Agatha in the center. Below are detailed views of all 3 statues. Agatha is the patron saint of rape victims, breast cancer patients, wet nurses, and bell founders of all things due to the shape of her severed breasts. She's also considered a powerful intercessor when people suffer from fires, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. Thank you for joining me to learn a little bit about this fascinating maker of history here on The Armchair Traveler. Thank you for joining me to investigate the life and lore of today's maker of history. If you'd like to dig deeper, visit my regular blog, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently, as well as more information on historical figures and places. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen and in the description box below.